What if vampires were never just monsters of fiction, but echoes of real fear, disease, and forgotten history? Long before Dracula, ancient civilizations believed the dead could rise, feed on the living, and spread death itself. Graves were opened. Bodies were staked. Villages panicked. Tonight, we uncover the secret history of vampires, tracing their origins from ancient legends and medical mysteries to the dark truths hidden beneath folklore. This is not fantasy. This is history, where fear, blood, and immortality collide. Welcome to a story humanity has been telling for thousands of years, and one that refuses to die. Thank you to viewers. Thank you for watching and exploring this dark chapter of history with us. If you enjoyed this deep dive into ancient legends and hidden truths, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your curiosity keeps these stories alive. Shadows at the dawn of civilization. Long before vampires stalked the pages of Gothic novels or haunted moonlit castles on screen, they existed as something far older and far more intimate: fear given form. At the dawn of civilization, when humanity first settled into cities and began to record its thoughts in stone and clay, death was not understood as a clean ending. It was mysterious, unpredictable, and frighteningly active. The dead did not always stay silent, and when misfortune struck the living, the blame often returned to those who had already passed. In the ancient world, survival depended on explanation. Storms, droughts, disease, and sudden death demanded meaning. When no natural cause could be found, the supernatural stepped in. The vampire was not yet a creature with fangs and capes. It was a restless presence, an unseen force that fed on life itself. One of the earliest written sources of proto-vampire belief comes from ancient Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization. Sumerian and Akkadian tablets describe spirits known as the Adimu or Akimu, ghosts of those who died violently, were improperly buried, or were forgotten by their families. These spirits were believed to wander the night, draining vitality from the living, spreading sickness, madness, and despair. They were not evil by choice. They were hungry, neglected, and bound by unfinished obligations. Blood, in these early cultures, was synonymous with life. To lose blood was to lose strength, identity, and divine favor. When someone fell ill or wasted away without visible injury, it was easy to imagine that something unseen was feeding on them. The vampire myth grew not from imagination alone, but from observation filtered through fear. Similar beliefs emerged independently across the ancient world, suggesting that vampiric ideas were a universal human response to death and decay. In ancient India, the Vedala was a spirit that inhabited corpses, hanging upside down from trees and whispering riddles to travelers. Though often depicted as clever or even humorous, the Vedala represented the disturbing idea that a body could be reoccupied after death. In early China, legend spoke of the Jiangshi, a reanimated corpse driven by corrupted qi or life energy. These beings did not drink blood in the Western sense but absorbed vitality from the living. They moved stiffly as real corpses do, and were said to emerge when burial rites were improperly performed. Again, the lesson was clear: respect the dead or the dead will return. Even in ancient Egypt, where death rituals were among the most elaborate in history, there existed fear of the restless dead. The Egyptians believed that improper mummification or neglected offerings could result in a spirit returning to torment the living. Protective spells were placed in tombs not only to safeguard the dead, but to protect the living from them. Archaeology provides chilling confirmation that these fears were not merely symbolic. Across Europe and Asia, ancient graves have been discovered containing unusual precautions. Stones placed on chests to pin bodies down, limbs bound, heads removed, or mouths stuffed with clay, ash, or bricks. These were not punishments, but protections, measures taken by grieving families who feared that love alone was not enough to keep the dead at rest. To modern observers, such practices may seem barbaric or irrational, yet they reveal something profoundly human. Early societies lacked medical knowledge of decomposition. They did not understand why bodies bloated, why nails and hair appeared to grow, or why blood sometimes leaked from mouths after death. What they saw looked like signs of continued life. Faced with these sights, they did what humans have always done: they told stories to survive the fear. Importantly, early vampiric entities were rarely glamorous or seductive. They were associated with hunger, coldness, and decay. They were often former members of the community, neighbors, relatives, children, whose deaths felt unfinished. This made them far more terrifying than distant monsters. The vampire was familiar. It wore a known face. These ancient legends also reveal an early moral framework. Those most likely to return as restless dead were outsiders. Criminals, the unbaptized, strangers, or those who violated social norms. In this way, proto-vampires enforced cultural rules even after death. Fear became a form of social order. At its core, the vampire myth was born from humanity's first confrontation with mortality. Civilization brought writing, architecture, and law, but it also brought overcrowding, disease, and mass death. The vampire was a shadow cast by progress itself, emerging wherever life and death existed too closely together. By the end of the ancient era, the foundations of vampire lore were firmly set. The restless dead, the draining of life, the power of proper burial, and the thin boundary between worlds. These ideas would not fade. They would travel, evolve, and deepen as civilization moved forward. The vampire did not begin as a monster of fantasy. It began as a question humanity could not yet answer. What happens when the dead do not stay dead? Blood, disease, and the medieval mind. By the Middle Ages, the vampire had taken on a far more concrete and terrifying form, particularly across Eastern and Southeastern Europe. This era was defined by instability. War swept repeatedly across borders, famine hollowed out entire regions, and disease moved faster than knowledge could follow. In a world where death was omnipresent and poorly understood, fear demanded explanation, and the vampire became one of the most convincing answers. Medieval people lived close to death. Average life expectancy was low, infant mortality was high, and epidemics could erase generations within a single season. When death struck suddenly or repeatedly within the same household, it felt personal, intentional, almost predatory. The idea that a deceased family member might be responsible offered a grim sense of order. The chaos had a cause. Across Slavic regions, Greece, the Balkans, and parts of Eastern Europe, different names described remarkably similar beings: the Uper, Vrikalakas, Strigoi, and Nosferatu. These were not distant monsters but revenants, the dead who returned to prey upon their own communities. They were believed to rise at night, draining blood or life force, spreading illness and slowly destroying families from within. The most chilling detail was consistency. The vampire almost always attacked relatives first. This belief mirrored real patterns of disease transmission. Tuberculosis, often called consumption, caused victims to grow pale, lose weight, and cough blood. It spread easily among those living in close quarters, families, monasteries, villages. When one person died and others soon followed, the explanation seemed obvious to medieval minds. The dead were feeding on the living. Death itself appeared deceptive. When graves were opened weeks or months after burial, bodies sometimes showed signs that looked unmistakably alive. Gases produced during decomposition caused bloating, giving corpses a plump, well-fed appearance. As skin shrank, fingernails and teeth seemed longer. Blood, forced from the lungs and stomach, could leak from the mouth and nose, staining burial shrouds. To a medieval observer, these were not natural processes. They were proof of recent feeding. Certain medical conditions reinforced the myth even further. Porphyria, a rare blood disorder, caused extreme sensitivity to sunlight, gum recession, reddish or purplish teeth, and severe pain. Rabies, transmitted through animal bites, produced aggression, insomnia, aversion to light and water, and a tendency to bite others. In an age without germ theory, such symptoms looked less like illness and more like possession or transformation. Blood itself held deep symbolic power. It represented lineage, inheritance, covenant, and the soul. In Christian theology, blood was both sacred and salvific, the medium through which Christ offered eternal life. The vampire inverted this sacred symbolism. It promised immortality not through divine grace but through theft. Not through sacrifice but through predation. This made the vampire not only terrifying but heretical. Church authorities did not dismiss vampire beliefs outright. In fact, many church records from the 12th to 17th centuries describe official investigations into alleged cases of vampirism. Priests, local officials, and even physicians were called to examine graves. If a corpse appeared undecayed, bloated, or bloodied, it was declared dangerous. The prescribed solutions were grim but methodical: staking the heart, decapitation, burning, or reburial with protective rites. These acts were not viewed as superstition. They were seen as necessary interventions, spiritual quarantines intended to protect the living. The vampire hunt functioned much like an early form of public health response, combining religion, fear, and ritual in the absence of scientific understanding. Importantly, not everyone was equally at risk of becoming a vampire. Social outsiders were especially vulnerable. Those who died by suicide, criminals, strangers, the unbaptized, or people accused of immoral behavior were more likely to be suspected of returning from the grave. In this way, vampirism reinforced social boundaries even after death. The fear of becoming a vampire encouraged conformity, religious obedience, and proper burial rites. The medieval vampire was not seductive or romantic. It was bloated, ruddy, animalistic, and horrifyingly familiar. It wore the face of someone known. This familiarity made the legend powerful. The threat was not lurking in distant forests or ruined castles. It was buried in the churchyard, waiting. Psychologically, vampires also carried the weight of grief and guilt. Survivors sometimes blamed themselves for improper funerals, unresolved conflicts, or forgotten prayers. The idea that the dead returned angry or hungry reflected unresolved emotional bonds between the living and the dead. In the medieval mind, the boundary between life and death was dangerously thin. The vampire existed precisely in that fragile space, between belief and biology, faith and fear. It was a product of real suffering interpreted through limited knowledge, shaped by disease, devotion, and desperation. By the late medieval period, vampire lore had spread widely, carried by Travelli. The medieval vampire panic. The Middle Ages were a time of profound fear and superstition, and nowhere was this more evident than in the stories that began to circulate about creatures that fed on the living even after death. The medieval vampire panic, which gripped much of Eastern Europe from the 12th to the 17th centuries, was not merely the stuff of legend. It was a reflection of social anxieties, religious beliefs, and the precariousness of life in an era marked by disease and death. Unlike the modern conception of vampires as suave, immortal aristocrats, medieval vampires were terrifying, grotesque figures. They were often described as bloated and ruddy from drinking human blood, their bodies emanating a stench of decay. They were said to rise from their graves at night, preying on family members and neighbors alike. The panic surrounding these revenants was not a literary invention but a tangible phenomenon that provoked mass hysteria, ritualized exhumations, and even executions. The roots of this panic were manifold. In a Europe devastated by repeated waves of plague, famine, and war, the line between life and death was perilously thin. Decomposition was poorly understood, and bodies that appeared unusually preserved, or exhibited signs of swelling or bleeding from the mouth, could easily be interpreted as evidence of vampirism. A common occurrence, particularly in colder climates, was postmortem bloating. As gases built up within a corpse, the body could appear plump, and the blood could seep from the mouth or nose, fueling the belief that the deceased had been feeding on the living. Reports of vampire attacks often emerged during periods of crisis. Communities struck by disease were particularly susceptible to rumors of revenants. In 1725, for example, villagers in what is now Serbia began exhuming bodies that had been buried during a recent plague outbreak. They claimed to find corpses that were still fleshy and bloody, prompting them to perform rituals intended to neutralize the threat, stabbing the body with a stake, burning it, or decapitating it. While the well-known Serbian accounts are from the 18th century, similar reports existed as early as the 12th century in Poland, Hungary, and the Balkans, suggesting a long-standing cultural fear. Religious belief played a central role in shaping the vampire panic. In medieval Christian thought, death was not always final. The soul might linger, restless, if the body had not received proper burial rites or if the deceased had led a sinful life. Vampires were often portrayed as sinners or excommunicated individuals who had returned to punish the living. Monks, priests, and local clergy were called upon to guide communities in identifying and destroying these revenants. The Church's involvement lent authority to what might otherwise have been dismissed as superstition, reinforcing fear and ritual action. The panic was also deeply intertwined with local customs and folklore. In Slavic regions, for instance, vampires were often associated with liminal figures such as witches, heretics, or those who had died unnatural deaths, suicides, executed criminals, or unbaptized infants. Folk remedies for preventing vampirism included placing garlic, poppy seeds, or iron objects in graves, or binding the corpse with chains to prevent it from rising. Such practices reveal a blending of spiritual and practical concerns. These rituals were as much about community cohesion and control over the fear of death as they were about the supernatural. Perhaps the most vivid evidence of the panic comes from historical chronicles that document exhumations and executions. In 1590, in the village of Kisilova in present-day Romania, a series of mysterious deaths led villagers to suspect that a local woman had become a vampire. Upon opening her grave, witnesses reportedly found her corpse intact, with fresh blood on her lips. They drove a stake through her heart, and shortly thereafter, the deaths in the village ceased. Similar accounts appear throughout Eastern Europe. In Poland, Serbia, Hungary, and Bohemia, corpses were staked, decapitated, or burned in an effort to protect the living. These actions, though horrifying by modern standards, were considered legitimate communal responses to a genuine threat. The medieval vampire panic was also fueled by the transmission of reports through word of mouth, travelogues, and printed pamphlets. In the 16th century, scholars and physicians began documenting cases of suspected vampirism, blending observation with folklore. German scholars, for instance, wrote detailed descriptions of the blood-drinking dead of the Balkans, attributing disease outbreaks to these malevolent corpses. Such publications lent credence to local fears and helped spread the panic beyond isolated villages, making vampirism a topic of scholarly, and increasingly sensational, interest. Importantly, the vampire panic reflects broader anxieties of medieval life. Death was omnipresent, and disease often struck without warning. Communities clung to rituals, superstitions, and authoritative figures to make sense of their precarious existence. Vampires in this context were more than supernatural monsters. They were symbolic embodiments of the unknown and uncontrollable. They represented the dangers of failing to adhere to societal norms, of improper burial, or of moral transgression. The fear of vampirism, therefore, was as much about reinforcing social order and collective identity as it was about combating a literal threat. By the late 17th and early 18th centuries, the vampire panic began to wane, though it never disappeared entirely. Improved understanding of decomposition and disease, along with the rationalizing influence of the Enlightenment, gradually undermined the credibility of vampire legends. Nevertheless, the medieval panic left an indelible mark on European culture. It established enduring motifs: stake through the heart, garlic as a repellent, revenants returning to harm the living, that would echo in later vampire literature and folklore. In retrospect, the medieval vampire panic appears as a fascinating intersection of fear, folklore, and societal instability. It was not merely a curiosity of the past but a lens through which historians can understand how communities confronted death, disease, and moral anxiety. The panic illustrates the human propensity to create explanations for the inexplicable, to ritualize fear, and to enforce communal norms through both belief and action. While the vampires of the Middle Ages may have been imagined, the panic they inspired was very real, manifesting in grave robbing, stakings, and public hysteria that left a lasting imprint on the European imagination. Ultimately, the medieval vampire panic reminds us that monsters are often a reflection of ourselves. The revenants of Eastern Europe were not simply creatures of the night. They were embodiments of societal dread, religious uncertainty, and the pervasive human fear of death. In a time when the living were constantly confronted by mortality, the vampire was a chilling but understandable symbol of everything that communities sought to control, both in life and in death. From monster to mirror. The vampire that emerged from medieval graveyards was a creature of fear and superstition, grotesque in its decay and malevolent in its hunger. Yet, over the centuries, this monster underwent a profound transformation. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the vampire had shifted from a figure of communal panic to a symbol of personal and societal anxieties, a mirror reflecting the human psyche, cultural tensions, and moral dilemmas. The evolution of the vampire from a literal threat to a metaphorical one reveals not only changing tastes in literature and folklore but also the deeper currents shaping human imagination. The transition began in the Enlightenment era, a period characterized by scientific curiosity, rational inquiry, and skepticism of superstition. The European vampire panic of the 17th and early 18th centuries had left a trail of exhumed corpses and punctured graves, yet scholars and physicians increasingly sought natural explanations for these phenomena. Bloated bodies, postmortem bleeding, and other evidence of vampirism were reinterpreted as ordinary processes of decomposition or the effects of disease. While these rational explanations diminished the perceived literal threat of vampires, they could not entirely eradicate the fascination with the undead. The vampire, once feared as a tangible predator, became a symbol that could be explored through narrative, allegory, and imagination. One of the earliest stages of this transformation can be seen in the rise of Gothic literature. Novels such as The Vampire by John Polidori, 1819, and later Carmilla by Sheridan Le Fanu, 1872, reimagined vampires as sophisticated, often aristocratic figures whose danger lay as much in their psychological and emotional influence as in their physical predation. Polidori's Lord Ruthven, for instance, was not a bloated corpse clawing through the dirt but a charming, urbane manipulator who could insinuate himself into high society, seduce, and destroy. Similarly, Le Fanu's Carmilla introduced a vampiress whose threat was intimately personal, preying upon emotions and relationships rather than entire villages. These narratives marked a decisive shift. The vampire was no longer merely a monstrous other but a lens through which authors could explore desire, morality, and the tension between social convention and transgression. This metamorphosis was not accidental. The vampire became a mirror because it reflected anxieties that were increasingly psychological and social rather than physical. In the Gothic imagination, vampires embodied fears of sexual transgression, forbidden desire, and the decay of social order. In Polidori and Le Fanu, the vampire's bite became a metaphor for seduction, infection, and the corruption of innocence. By portraying vampires as elegant, persuasive, and morally ambiguous, these authors tapped into contemporary concerns about identity, sexuality, and the fragility of civilized norms. The monster was no longer external in the same way, it existed in the shadows of human consciousness, waiting for repression, guilt, or unacknowledged desire to animate it. The mirror metaphor deepened with the Victorian fascination with heredity, disease, and the subconscious. As medical science progressed, so too did cultural anxieties about degeneration, mental illness, and hidden pathology. Vampires became symbols of contagion in a metaphorical sense. The vampire's bite could spread corruption, just as disease could silently invade the body. Bram Stoker's Dracula, 1897, epitomized this synthesis of fear and reflection. Count Dracula is both an external invader and a mirror of European anxieties about race, sexuality, and the erosion of social boundaries. The novel portrays vampirism as a potent allegory for the intrusion of the foreign, the forbidden, and the repressed into the orderly, domestic, and familiar. Dracula is simultaneously monster and mirror, terrifying because he exposes the vulnerabilities and desires that polite society prefers to ignore. The transformation of the vampire also reflects shifting attitudes toward morality and the supernatural. In the medieval panic, vampires were unequivocally evil. Sinners, revenants, abominations that threatened the living. By the 19th century, however, vampires could be morally complex, tragic, or even sympathetic. They were creatures caught between life and death, desire and duty, attraction and repulsion. This moral ambiguity allowed them to serve as mirrors for human emotion and ethical reflection. Literature, theater, and eventually film could explore questions of consent, predation, and the shadow self through the figure of the vampire, turning horror into introspection. In this way, the vampire became a vehicle for cultural self-examination, a tool for probing the boundaries of societal norms and the depths of personal consciousness. The shift was not purely literary, it reflected broader cultural transformations. Industrialization, urbanization, and the rise of individualism altered how people conceived of danger and desire. Villages were no longer the primary sites of life and death crises. Cities offered new fears, anonymity, disease, moral corruption, that the vampire could symbolically inhabit. Similarly, changing attitudes towards sexuality, gender, and personal autonomy meant that stories about intimate predation carried potent social commentary. Female vampires, such as Carmilla, explored anxieties about female agency, same-sex desire, and the destabilization of patriarchal authority. Male vampires, particularly in Gothic novels, reflected fears about male dominance, predatory sexuality, and social stratification. Across these variations, the vampire's function as a mirror became increasingly pronounced. It was a creature onto which society projected its most pressing fears and desires. The 20th and 21st centuries would accelerate this trend, with vampires embodying a dizzying array of metaphors, from addiction and immortality to consumerism and identity politics. Yet the essential transformation, which began in the Enlightenment and matured in Gothic literature, remains pivotal. The vampire is no longer simply a monster to be destroyed, it is a reflection of human experience. What we fear, desire, and repress in ourselves can be seen in the vampire's eyes. What once demanded exhumation and stakes now demands examination and interpretation. The monster becomes a mirror, and through it, we confront the evolving contours of human morality, fear, and imagination. The truth beneath the legend. The vampire is, without question, one of the most enduring figures in global folklore and popular culture. From medieval graveyards in Eastern Europe to the silver screens of Hollywood, the image of the blood-drinking undead has captivated, terrified, and fascinated generations. Yet behind the fangs, capes, and supernatural theatrics lies a complex tapestry of human behavior, cultural fear, and historical circumstance. Understanding the truth beneath the legend requires peeling back layers of myth, superstition, and exaggeration to reveal the social, psychological, and scientific realities that gave rise to the vampire in the first place. The medieval vampire panic, as explored in earlier chapters, was rooted in misunderstanding the natural processes of death and decomposition. Bodies that appeared unusually preserved or showed signs of post-mortem bleeding were often interpreted as evidence of vampirism. Modern forensic science offers clear explanations for these phenomena. After death, corpses undergo a variety of changes: rigor mortis, bloating, and the movement of bodily fluids, which can create the illusion that a corpse is alive or has recently fed. In cold climates, decomposition can slow significantly, leaving a body looking remarkably intact weeks after burial. In the context of pre-scientific societies, where the mechanisms of decay were poorly understood, it is no surprise that communities interpreted these signs through the lens of supernatural belief. Disease also played a central role in shaping vampire legends. Epidemics of plague, tuberculosis, and other contagious illnesses often coincided with reported vampire attacks. The symptoms of these diseases, pallor, weakness, coughing up blood, closely mirrored the imagined effects of vampiric predation. In small, closely knit communities, the sudden deaths of multiple family members could easily be ascribed to supernatural causes. Accusations of vampirism provided a way to explain the inexplicable, to identify a tangible culprit for the tragedies that swept through villages. In this sense, the vampire was not only a monster but a social mechanism, a focus for collective anxiety in the face of uncontrollable mortality. Beyond biology and disease, the vampire legend reflects cultural attitudes toward morality, sin, and social order. In many societies, vampires were believed to be the restless dead who had led sinful lives, committed crimes, or died outside the church's protection. Rituals to prevent vampirism, staking, decapitation, burning, were as much about reinforcing religious and social norms as they were about eliminating a supernatural threat. By enacting these measures, communities asserted control over death, morality, and social cohesion. In a world where death was omnipresent and the future uncertain, such rituals provided a sense of agency and structure. Anthropologists and folklorists have also highlighted the symbolic dimensions of vampire legends. In Slavic folklore, vampires often reflected anxieties about family, inheritance, and generational conflict. Stories of a revenant preying on relatives could be interpreted as expressions of tension within households or communities. Similarly, the fear of outsiders or foreigners, particularly in border regions of Eastern Europe, often found expression in vampire tales, turning the undead into a metaphor for the alien and the unknown. In every case, the vampire functioned as a mirror, an imaginative projection of collective fears, moral concerns, and social tensions. Interestingly, some historical cases suggest that elements of vampire lore may have been inspired by real human behavior. Accounts from 16th and 17th century Eastern Europe describe individuals accused of vampirism who were seen consuming blood or performing rituals associated with death. While sensationalized in chronicles and pamphlets, these cases hint at the complex interplay between folklore and the real-life actions of humans navigating grief, disease, and fear. Anthropologists speculate that certain cultural practices, including the consumption of animal or even human blood in ritual contexts, could have contributed to the myth's vividness, giving the vampire a tangible, if horrifying, grounding in reality. As the legend traveled westward and entered literary and artistic culture, the vampire evolved further, shedding some of its literal associations while retaining its symbolic power. By the 19th century, authors like Polidori, Le Fanu, and Stoker reimagined vampires as aristocrats, seducers, and monsters of the mind rather than corpses in the ground. These literary vampires encapsulated a wide array of anxieties: sexual desire, predation, disease, and social upheaval. Modern scholarship recognizes that these fictional vampires, while removed from medieval superstition, still draw upon real historical and cultural phenomena, making them a bridge between human experience and imagination. The 20th century further transformed the vampire into a cultural icon, blending horror, romance, and fantasy. Film and television brought vampires to global audiences, emphasizing charisma, immortality, and psychological intrigue. In these narratives, the vampire often embodies the human struggle with desire, identity, and mortality. The legend persists precisely because it can be adapted to reflect contemporary fears and values. Just as medieval communities projected anxieties about disease, death, and sin onto the undead, modern audiences project concerns about sexuality, power, and ethics onto the vampires of film and literature. Scientific investigation has also illuminated the possible biological underpinnings of vampire mythology. Some researchers have suggested that rare conditions such as porphyria, a disorder affecting hemoglobin production, might explain certain vampire-like traits. Porphyria can cause sensitivity to sunlight, reddish teeth, and skin lesions, features that echo popular vampire imagery. While no direct causal link exists between the disorder and vampire folklore, such theories illustrate how myth and observation can intertwine in unexpected ways, grounding cultural fear in tangible human experience. Ultimately, the truth beneath the legend of the vampire is multifaceted. Vampires are neither entirely supernatural nor entirely real. They exist at the intersection of biology, psychology, and culture. From ancient Mesopotamia to modern pop culture, vampires have walked alongside humanity, embodying our deepest fears and desires. They are more than myths. They are reflections of our struggle with death, disease, power, and immortality. Though centuries have passed, their stories adapt, survive, and continue to haunt our imagination. The vampire reminds us that while life is fleeting, the questions of mortality and meaning are eternal. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the secret history of vampires. Remember to like, subscribe, and share. Your curiosity keeps these legends alive.